We're going to get started. We are in Parshat Balak, which is a fascinating parsha on many levels. Jeff and Martha, I'm just going to mute you. I think I'm getting some feedback. Oh, you muted yourselves. Okay. So Balak is a really interesting and unique parsha. It is, we'll get a little bit more into this, but it's really the only parsha and really the only extended section in Chumash, in Tanakh, which is told from the perspective of those other than the Jewish people. Right? It's a big question. The Haftorah kind of ruins the question, but as we're reading, the question has to be front and center to us, which is, are Bnei Yisrael aware of what's happening? Are they aware that Bilam is trying to curse them this whole time? Or are they totally ignorant and, ignorance is bliss and unaware of the threat that's being presented to them, against them? Right, so as I said, the Haftorah kind of ruins that. Let's get the source sheet up on our shared screen. And the Haftorah from Micha, the prophet says, Ami zechorna ma'yatz Balak melech Moav u'ma'ana oto Bilam ben Beor min hashitim al Gilgal l'man da'at tzidkot Hashem. Right? So the prophet says, my nation, remember what Balak wanted to do to us. But it's until that point, it's unclear that we had any awareness of what Balak wanted to do in of Bilam's attempts. Right? So much so that the Gemara in Bava Batra tells us, right, discussing who wrote different passages of Tanakh, and generally Chumash is not up for discussion. We assume that Moshe wrote all of Chumash. There's only a debate about the final 8 psukim, right? Could Moshe have written about his own death? But everything until the very, very end of Sefer Devarim, we assume that Moshe is the author of, directed by God, but that Moshe is the author. So the Gemara in Bava Batra says, Moshe katav sifro, Moshe wrote his book, meaning Torah, uparshat Bilam, the Iyov. And Moshe also wrote Parshat Bilam and Iyov, and he wrote the book of Iyov. Very interesting why that Moshe wrote Iyov, and there's a lot of discussion about when Iyov lived. It's a really interesting Gemara, so let's read the rest of it. Yoshua katav sifro, ushmona psukim shebetorah. Yoshua wrote Sefer Yoshua, the book of Joshua, and the final 8 psukim of the Torah, which talk about Moshe's death. So Moshe could not have written that on his own, according to this perspective in the Gemara. Shmuel katav sifro v'shoftim v'rut. Shmuel is the author of Shmuel, right? We have Shmuel Aleph and Shmuel Bet, but it was only one book and was divided as a more of a publisher's convenience than anything else. So Shmuel wrote that, and he wrote the book of Shoftim, of Judges, and Megillah of Ruth. David katav Sefer Tehillim, etc., etc. Right, he had some help, or some other sections were written by others. But the Gemara tells us that Moshe wrote Sifro, his book, and he wrote Parshat Bilam. The section of Bilam is seen as a separate entity, a separate piece than the rest of Torah, which is very strange, right? I mean, content-wise, it's not so strange, right? It would require special insight for us to know that Moshe had an awareness of what was going on, right? And that might be the greatest proof of the prophetic nature of the Torah. Interestingly, this is really a side note. This is not the focus of the shir tonight, but the Ritva, and there was not a digitized version of the Ritva I could easily get to, so I just have the English translation. Based on this Gemara, the Ritva says, in number 3, let me make sure you can see it. This would seem to support those who say that the reference here, right, Sefer Bilam, is not the story to Bilam that is written in the Torah, for that is written by the Holy One, blessed be He, along with the rest of the Torah, but rather to a separate parsha which Moshe wrote at greater length, in which they still possessed. Right? That actually he thinks it can't be that the assertion Moshe wrote Parshat Bilam refers to what we have in the Chumash as the story of Bilam. It has to be some other text of Bilam, a more elaborate story, a more elaborate telling of it that we've subsequently lost, but that they did have at the time. So that's a pretty radical position, right? Rashi and most others disagree with this. Rashi says in number 4, Parshat Bilam. How does Rashi understand Parshat Bilam? Nivuato Mishalav, his prophecy and his parables that he speaks of in our parsha. Even though they are not, they were not Moshe's, even though they were, and they don't seem to be necessary to the rest of the Torah, right? Why do we need to know what what Balak is conspiring against Bnei Israel? Why do we need to know about Bilam's attempts to curse us? So that's certainly the normative position, but there is that radical position of the Ritva. And then finally, to kind of round out this introduction, we have a very interesting position of the Chatam Sofer. Okay, this is just a summary. This is not the entire tshuva. But the Chatam Sofer says that this parsha of Balak is the parsha which really tests our faith more than any other parsha in the Torah. Why is that? Because we have no outside verification, right? This is totally prophetic, right? So the skeptics, the biblical critics might say, oh, how could anyone know, right? This might be proof that it's made up, but if we are coming from a traditional, right, a firm perspective, so then it's testimony to God's omnipotence and to the prophetic nature of the Torah that we have recorded something that no one in our camp would have had any knowledge or awareness of. So that's sort of the interesting introduction to this fascinating parsha. What I wanted to focus on, and it's already in the title of the source sheet, is there are many who try to connect our parsha, the story of Balak and Bilam, to prior story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, of the Exodus. Right? And there's a lot of sources we can point to. A really interesting one is the Gemara in Sota, source number 6. I can't get the full Hebrew with the English, so we'll just leave it like that. Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Simai. Shlosha hayu b'ota eitza. So this is talking about Paro's decision to persecute the Hebrew slave, the Hebrews at the beginning, right before they were slaves. The decision to enslave them, the decision to drown the baby boys. So he says that Paro had 3 main advisors who helped, he consulted with about making this decision and this ruling. Bilam, the Eov, the Yitro, right? All familiar names to us. The 3 advisors to Paro were Bilam, Eov, and Yitro. Bilam, what did Bilam do when Paro said, "Is this, what should we do? Should we drown the Hebrews so we make them slaves?" Sheya'atz neherag. He offered Paro counsel. He gave the plan. He supported the plan. He was involved in the plan, and as a result, he was ultimately killed. Eov sheshatak. Eov remained silent. Nidon b'yisurim. So that explains all the afflictions, all the troubles that befell Eov, is because he didn't speak up against Paro. He remained silent. Yitro shebarach zaku libnei banav sheyashvu b'lishkat hagazit. Yitro ran away. Yitro wanted no part of it. Yitro reprimanded Paro, said, "You can't do anything like this." When Paro didn't listen, he ran away. And therefore, he merited that his great-grandchildren sat in the temple, right? Whether that's because through Moshe, right? His great-grandchildren would have been Leviim serving in the Beis HaMikdash, or whether that's we discussed this earlier. I forget which parsha we discussed it in. I think Parshat Naso maybe, but right. or the idea that maybe even if Yitro didn't remain with Bnei Israel, that his other children did. So he had direct descendants who remained with Bnei Israel, who were given a special portion. Okay, but so the Gemara tells us that Bilam was was a key player in the story of the Exodus, right? In the beginning of the story before the Exodus, right? In the enslavement, in the persecution of Bnei Israel, that it was actually Bilam who was the only advisor to Paro who offered advice and counsel and seemed to support the plan. And so, so there is an implied connection in the Gemara. What I wanted to do is spend some time looking at what that connection might be, and kind of comparing it. Much of this comes from one of my dear teachers, Rabbi Nathaniel Helfgott, who I believe served as a scholar in residence at Netivot in our early days. And now he actually is the rabbi of a shul in Teaneck called Netivot Shalom. And oftentimes people get confused with me and him over who the rabbi of Netivot Shalom is. So his book, which is, 80% of the essays in his book are focused on Sefer Bamidbar, and they originally appeared on the virtual Beit Midrash, the website of Yeshivat Har Etzion. So a lot of this comes from his treatment of the parsha, but there's some others who influenced it as well. So let's, with that introduction, let's take a step back and see what our parsha has to say. All right, so this is just the very opening of the parsha. We're not going to do more than a few psukim, but to get everyone back in the mindset of what exactly happens. Sorry, before we go there, are there any questions to our long introduction? I guess we call it a preamble to our parsha shir, to this sort of laying the setting for what's transpiring. No? Okay. So the parsha opens. Vayar Balak ben Tzipor et kol asher asa Yisrael la'emori. Balak ben Tzipor saw all that Israelite did to the Amorites. Vayagar Moav mipnei ha'am me'od ki ravu. Vayakatz Moav mipnei bnei Israel. Moav was very afraid and alarmed of the nation because they were great and they dreaded the Israelites. Vayomer Moav el ziknei Midyan, Ata yilachachu hakahal et kol svivotenu ki ocholcha shtor et yerek hasadeh. Ubalak ben Tzipor melech l'Moav be'etahi. Moab said to the elders of Midian, this horde will lick clean all that is about us as an ox licks up the grass of the field. Balak ben Tzipor was the king of Moab at that time. It's a very strange introduction to Balak. Right? Why doesn't it tell us at the beginning that he was the king? It gives us this whole interlude is discussing with other nations. Then, oh, by the way, he was the king. He was an important guy. Vayishlach malachim el Bil'am ben Be'or Petora al Nahar Eretz b'nei Amo likro lo le'mor hinei am yatzam miMitzrayim hinei chisat in ha'aretz v'hu yoshev imoli. He sends messengers to Bil'am ben Be'or in Petor, which is on the river with the border of his nation, to call him to say, a nation has left Egypt and is covering the eye of the earth, and they are dwelling there right opposite me. They're on my border. Atalachana arali eta'am hazeh ki atzum hu mimeni, ulai uchal nakebo, v'agarshenu min ha'aretz ki yadati et asher tevarech mevarach v'et asher ta'or you are. So come and curse this nation for me, because they are great. They are greater than me. Maybe we can together strike them and kick them out, because I know that whoever you bless is blessed, and whoever you curse is cursed. Vayelchu ziknei Moav v'ziknei Midyan uksamim biyadam vayavo el Bil'am vayidabru elav divrei Balak. So the elders of Moab and Midyan and their magicians with their divination in their hands set out, and they come to Bil'am and they tell him the words of Balak. It's a very strange introduction to this whole parsha. But that is how it, right? And then, of course, the story transpires. Bilam originally says there's no way no way I can curse Bnei Israel, no way I can go against what Hashem wants. But Balak sends him more gifts, gives him more honor, says, you're our man, you're the only one who can do it. And he begrudgingly goes. The whole story with his donkey, trying to convince him not to do it. He disregards the donkey. 3 different times he gets up to curse Bnei Israel, and he winds up giving them blessings instead, including famously the Matovu. And then they, he realizes he's not going to curse them. He gives some prophecy about what's going to happen in the future, in the end of days. And then we have at the very end of the parsha, well, if we can't beat them with our prophet, let's beat them with our women. And they send the prostitutes to seduce and to cause trouble for Bnei Israel, and that's successful. And then very end of the parsha, we're introduced to Pinchas, and we'll focus on Pinchas next week. So before we get into picking this parsha apart, does anything strike you from this introduction to the opening verses of the parsha?
Okay.
For one thing, the expression Balak, son of Zippor, who was king of Moab at that time.
Mm-hmm.
That's intriguing,
Yeah.
We know now that the defeat of Sichon and Og was simply because there were Amorites there. We weren't claiming to have the right to the land outright at that point yet, but there were Amorites there. But the Moabites, if they had heard what had happened with Edom and with the Ammonites, they wouldn't have. Why were they really so nervous about this? It doesn't. They see a big group of people, but the others could tell them, well, they just wanted to go through the land. What?
Right. So you were not with us last week. We discussed this last week in the context of Edom. That maybe even if they come in peace, a nation of 1.2 million people marching through might pose a threat, even if they claim they're coming in peace. But but there is now verification that they really do mean it when they say we don't want to fight you. So yeah, it's interesting why they're so afraid. That certainly is striking. Rena, it looks like you wanted to say something.
Yeah, the whole idea of cursing a nation, I mean, that doesn't sound like business as usual. If that were true, then Paro wouldn't have had to have his whole plan about eliminating much of the Jewish population and the Israelite threat.
Mm-hmm.
Could have just cursed them and that would have been that. But I mean, do we have any other instances other than God cursing all right, it'll come to me later. It just seems very strange that this is how a king would conduct business, affairs of state.
Yeah, I mean, it is possible that, these are different nations with different religions, presumably. So even, just that Paro didn't try it isn't in itself proof. But it is. It doesn't seem like the normal way, or it could be giving up, right? That we realize we can't, either because Bnei Israel was seen as such a strong military threat, or because they knew of what happened with Egypt and others, that they weren't going to stand a chance to go about the conventional route. It could be that they were resorting to more desperate measures. But it is strange that this is what he decides to do. Anything else? Any other features of this that jump out? So there's also, right, we're not going to do this tonight, but in addition to, we're going to explore connections with the story of the Exodus. Any other stories, earlier stories from the Chumash alluded to here?
Well, the Egyptians are worried about the numbers all the time.
Right. Specifically,
They know.
Hiyadati et asher tivarich mivorach v'asher ta'or
Yes.
you are. What does that remind us of?
God's promise to Abraham.
Yeah, to Abraham. Right. So there's a lot of similarities with Abraham as well, and right, maybe next year we can look at some of those. Right. But there is that connection as well. So anyway, as I said, our focus is going to be on connections with Egypt and the Exodus story. So before I show you what I came up with and what Rabbi Helfgott came up with, anyone else have any ideas on their own about what some connections might be? Either in the details or kind of bigger thematic broad strokes.
Strange.
All right, so we'll get into it. So first, a few linguistic ones. Many point out that in Balak's petition to Bilam and in the introduction, there's a strong emphasis on identifying Bnei Israel as Am, as a nation, right? Hine Am yatsa mitzrayim, ata lachana arali et ha'am hazeh, vayagar Moav mipnei ha'am me'od. Oh, sorry, I don't have the chart on the screen, sorry. All right, it splits between the two pages, so not, but we'll go here. Right, so that the use of the word Am figures prominently in the Exodus story as well. Paro says, "Vayomer el amo hine Am b'nei Yisrael rav atzum mimenu." Bnei Yisrael is a nation which is great and mightier than us. Vayomer el amo hine Am b'nei Yisrael rav atzum mimenu v'kasher yanu ato ken yarbeh v'chenifot. Nope, that's not that's the wrong box. And many point out that Paro is actually the first person to call Bnei Israel by Am. It's not God, it's not Yaakov, it's not any of the Shvatim. It's actually Paro who is the first to identify them as a nation, as a bona fide nation, as an Am. So that's the first connection that people know. What is the fear that Balak has of Bnei Israel? Vayagar Moav mipnei ha'am me'od ki ravhu. Right? They were very alarmed because Bnei Israel was so numerous. Vayishlach malachim al Bilam ben Beor Petor asher al hanar eretz b'nei amoli kolo limor hinei am yatzam mitzrayim hinei chisat in haaretz v'hu yoshev mimuli. Right, the nation is so great that they're literally covering the eye of the land. Curse this nation because they are mightier, more numerous than I. Right, and what was Paro's fear of Bnei Israel that led to the enslavement and the persecution? Hine am Bnei Israel rav ve'atzum mimenu. Bnei Israel is much more numerous for us. Right? The more that they oppressed them, the more they increased and spread out. Right, and also vayakutsu mipnei bnei Israel. They came to dread the Israelites. Right, and in our parsha we have vayakatz Moav mipnei bnei Israel. Moav was dreaded or alarmed because of the Israelites. The same verb. So the fear, the same driving fear, the concern. Right, the overwhelming population concern, the demographics, is what drives both stories. I don't really have a pasuk to point to for the next points, but what is it that Balak does? This is what you spoke about. It says, I can't beat them, they're too numerous, they're too strong, so what's his strategy, what's his plan of attack?
Go and curse them. Yeah.
He wants to curse them, right? So how does
Like Pharaoh calls them the magicians. Yeah.
he curses them by calling in this Bilam figure who is a prophet, who's a diviner of some sort. And what figures prominently in the story of Exodus? I only brought one set of psukim. But when Aaron and Moshe first come to Paro, right, they do the trick with the staff where Aaron's staff turns into a snake. And then we read, Vayikra gam paro lachachamim v'lamacheshafim vayasu gam heim chartumei mitzrayim b'lahateim kein. So Paro calls his magicians and his diviners, and the Egyptian magicians do the same thing. But then vayashlichu ishmateu vayula taninim. So they throw their sticks to the ground and they turn into snakes or to serpents. Vayivla mate Aaron et matotan. But Aaron's staff swallows theirs. Paro hardens his heart and doesn't do as Moshe and Aaron requested, just as God predicted just as God said he would do. Right? So, and this repeats itself several times throughout the course of the Makot, throughout the course of the plagues, where whatever plague, whatever miracle Moshe and Aaron do, Paro calls his magicians. They're able to replicate a couple of them, the first two, until they get to a point where they can't do it, right? So Dam Tzfardea, the Egyptian sorcerers repeat, and then it gets to Kinim, and they're not able to do it, right? And eventually, in the middle, they throw up their hands. They say, "What do you want?" Right? Etzba Lokimhi. Clearly, this is the hand of God. Give up and let these people go already. There's nothing we can do to stop them. So not only do we have in both stories the powerful king calling in the magicians or the prophets or whatever these we want to describe them as, but we also then have the subsequent embarrassment of these sorcerers, right? The magicians in Egypt eventually are useless to Paro. They don't even try anymore. They throw up their hands and say, "It's over, we can't do anything." And Bilam, of course, fails 3 times to curse the nation, right? He's humiliated by his donkey, right? There's all sorts of showing that these magicians, these sorcerers, have no real power against Hashem. In both stories, we have a confession, a sort of vidui in the middle. Right, so it happens a couple times in the unfolding of the story of the Exodus, where Paro calls Moshe and Aaron. Vayishlach Paro vayikol Moshe el Aaron vayomer alehem chatati hapam Hashem hatzadik v'ani v'ami harashaim. I have sinned this time. God is right, and me and my nation are wicked, are evil, are in the wrong. Bilam also, when after the donkey strays the 3rd time, and he finally his eyes are open and he's able to see the angel. Vayomer Bilam el malach Hashem chatati ki lo yadati ki ata nitzav likrati b'derech. I have sinned because I didn't know that you were standing in front of me. Ata im ra beinecha ashuv ali. And if it's bad, if what I'm doing is bad in your eyes, I'll turn around and go back. In both instances, of course, the king, they don't. They forget very quickly their confession and they continue with their attempts to outwit, to outsmart, to prevail over Bnei Israel, and that, of course, ultimately doesn't end up well. But we have the confession followed by by reneging. The phrase that we saw earlier when Balak was concerned about the numbers of Bnei Israel, it's a very interesting phrase that he uses. It is covering the eye of the lamp. Is that familiar? So if you look just in the box next to it in our chart, this is in the plague of Arbe, of locusts. So when Moshe is telling Paro about the upcoming plague of Arbe, of locusts, says, if you refuse to set my people free, I'm going to bring this locust in your borders. V'chisa et ein haaretz. It will cover the eye of the land. Lo yuchal lirot et haaretz. And the land won't be able to be seen. The achal et yeter hapleita will eat whatever produce is left over from the barad, from the hail. Right? So this phrase, v'chisa et ein haaretz, is a very unique phrase. I've never heard that. I'm not aware of that in any other context. So that's another strong connection between the two. And then finally, this was really interesting, and this comes from Rabbi Amnon Bazak, who also is someone whose teachings I share frequently. When Balak reaches out to Bilam, he says, "Vayishlach malachim el Bilam ben Beor Petzora asher al hanar eretz bnei amo likol limor hine am yatsa mimitzrayim." A nation has departed Egypt. Hine chisa et ein haaretz, and as we saw, it covers the eye of the land. And then again, when Bilam repeats back to God what Balak, why he's going on this mission that's doomed to fail. Vayomer Bilam el Elokim Balak ben Tzipor melech Moav shalach elai. So Bilam tells God that Balak, the king of Moab, sent for me. Hine am hayotzei mimitzrayim. Hine am hayotzei mimitzrayim veyachas et ein haaretz. There's a nation that left Egypt and is covering the eye of the land. Anything seem a little bit off in that description of what happened and what Bnei Israel did? The nation left Egypt. Is that how we would describe what happened? God took a nation out of Egypt, right? So Rabbi Bazak says, Balak views the world from a secular perspective. He lacks a profound understanding that it was God who brought Bnei Israel out of Egypt. And what, of course, is the overlying mission and purpose of the entire story of the Exodus? It's to get Paro and Mitzrayim to know and recognize God, right? Vayomer Paro mi Hashem asher eshma bekolo. As the story begins, Paro has never heard of God. The entire point, right, it's really a twofold mission. It's one, to get Paro and the Egyptians to recognize and understand and appreciate and see that there is Hashem, that Hashem is really in control, and right, also to get Bnei Israel to recognize and buy into God. But that in both stories we have a denial of God's role, lack of recognition and awareness of God, and so that's another very strong connection. Okay, so interesting. I hope I've convinced you that there is a connection. Who cares? Why? What's the point? Why is there such a connection between the two? Any ideas? Any thoughts on why there would be a deliberate and intentional parallels and connection between the story of Balak and the story of the Exodus of Egypt? Yes, Rena or Robert.
It would seem that maybe to drive home the point that God is steering everything. I mean, you already described Balak as one of the prakim of the Torah that most requires you to suspend disbelief and just believe that God is doing this. And we know because how would we know about this stuff? Mm-hmm. And similarly, the events in Exodus, primarily in Bo, I guess it is, where all those things happen, it's also the same kind of thing. Before, nobody really knows about God, and here, all of a sudden, the hand of God is controlling everything.
Right,
so,
right. And that's the exact point that Rabbi Bazak concludes this section with, right? It is the same non-recognition of God that stands at the foundation of Balak's initiative. Had he drawn the right conclusions from the Exodus from Egypt, he would not have faced the humiliating reversal of his plan, which came to teach him the same lesson. Right? So it's to teach the world, this has some lasting power, right? Bnei Israel is here to stay, and God is here to stay, and you should conduct yourselves appropriately.
I think another point is that no matter what happens, no matter how obvious God's hand is, there are always going to be people who view the world of the Jews in a purely secular light.
Okay, so there's not only a physical threat, but there will always be an ideological or philosophical contentions, battles that we have to wage and be aware of. That's certainly going on here. So Rabbi Helfgott, I'm not sure it's radically different from what we've said, but he puts it in slightly different context. And as he says it, I'm picking up from the end of the fourth line in source number 9. In a word, the Balak-Bilam episode is a mini Yetziat Mitzrayim narrative as it applies to the specific situation of the new generation about to enter the land of Israel. In a certain sense, for the new generation to be able to enter the land, they must go through parallel experiences of the forefathers, picking up the thread and completing the mission, not letting it go off kilter as had happened 38 years before. Given this comparison, we should also note some of the differences between the two Exodus stories. While in Shemot, the Jewish people are actually enslaved and suffer, here it is only the threat that looms over their head. And here, God alone, in sort of a refuah kodem lemaka, right, that the healing, the remedy is given before the affliction, preparing the antidote, he translated it, preparing the antidote before the disease, nips the threat in the bud. Also, in contrast to the Shemot narrative, where Moshe and Aaron play such a prominent role, here Moshe is totally absent. God alone does it all. Right, and so that's right. It's also sort of laying the groundwork, perhaps, for what things will be like moving forward. Right, we're not going to be in the world of overt miracles, where we're going to be, God is still going to be providing protection for us, but in a very different way. And so it's kind of prepping them or getting them into that mode of existence. Which again raises the very interesting question, was there any awareness of this, right? Is it kind of like a message for us, many generations later, looking back and seeing that God constantly provides protection for the Jewish people? Or was it kind of a message for the Jewish people, for Bnei Israel at the time, that God still has your back? Right, that's a really interesting way to think about the story, and it could be seen in both ways. One more final source, and with this we will conclude, is Sfat Emet picks up on something really interesting as well, which I think builds off of what we've said up to this point. So in the unfolding of the story of Balak and Bilam, Balak sends to Bilam, and he says to him, Vayomer Bilam, this is Bilam echoing back Balak's words, the same verses we just saw. Balak ben Tzipor melech Moav shalach elai. Balak, the king of Tzipor, Balak ben Tzipor, the king of Moav, sent to me. Hinei ha'am hayotzei miMitzrayim, vayechas et ein ha'aretz, atah lecha kavali oto, la yochal leilachem bo v'gerashtiv. The nation that left Egypt and is covering the eye of the land, come curse them for me. Maybe you can fight them and we can kick them out. And then in one of the attempted curses, which turns into blessing, Bilam says as follows: El motziam mimitzrayim ketelafot re'im lo. God who freed them from Egypt is for them like the horns of the wild ox. So I just read the translation of this, but there was one inaccuracy in what I translated. Does anyone notice anything that was inaccurate or wrong about how these verses are translated? It's very subtle.
It's lo and not lahem. To him and not to them.
Where do you see that?
At the end.
Oh,
Lo.
okay.
It's
like Ketofot Re'im Lo.
low.
Yeah,
For him.
so that's talking about the nation. So
Yeah.
yeah, that could be for them. I mean, that's not what I had in mind. That is an inaccuracy. It's not an exact translation. Although I think poetically that might work. Okay.
Ketofot.
All right. So I'll read the key phrase in the Hebrew, and then maybe someone can pick up on it. Hine ha'am hayotzei mimitzrayim. What's yotzei?
Goes out. But El Motzi, at least it's acknowledging that God is the one who brought them out of Egypt.
Right. The what? Right. So if you were to translate Am hayotzei mimitzrayim and El Motzi Am, translate.
God who, no, it's not freed them, who brought them out. The nation went out and God brought them out, basically.
Okay. Does everyone agree with Rena's translation?
I don't know. I don't know if I'm on the right track here.
No, you are. We're in the wrong tense, though. Am hayotzei is not the past tense. Am hayotzei mimitzrayim is the present tense. El motziam, God who is bringing them out. Present tense. Not the past tense.
And there's no vav hamahapeh
Yeah.
either.
So the Sfat Emet picks up on this. B'lashon hapasuk ha'am hayotzi mimitzrayim ki bilam hayam yotzei paro l'shabed b'nei Yisrael v'ra'at ratzah gam ata b'nachashov v'achazir otam l'mitzrayim. Right, so he alludes to the Gemara we already saw that Bilam was one of the advisors of to Paro originally to enslaving them. Lachin amar hayotzei. So therefore he said hayotzei in the present tense. Ki adayin lo nigmar yitziatam. The exodus is not yet complete. Lachin matzati bezohar debala atvon un l'mitzrayim ayin sham. Right, the Zohar says that his entire purpose, his entire goal was to return them to Egypt. And that's why it says El Motziam, God who is taking them out. Because he saw that he could not touch on the freedom which God gave us when he took us out of Egypt. Right, so a very interesting thing we didn't talk about at all tonight is the Gemara in Brachot tells us that originally this entire parsha, or some reference, hard to imagine it would really be the entire 3 or 4 prakim, but they wanted to include Parshat Balak as part of the Kriyat Shema, part of the paragraphs of the Shema that we say every day. V'chein katav ami zacharna, and right quotes the pasuk from Micha we saw at the beginning. My nation, remember what Balak wanted to do to you. K'moshe mitzvah lizkor yetziat Mitzrayim b'chol yom, ken yesh lizkor b'chesed Hashem sh'asa imanu lahafer atzat bil'am harasha. Just as we have to remember every day the miracles of the exodus of Egypt, we also have to remember the kindness that God did for us by protecting us from Bilam's attempts to curse. Okay, so for the Sfat Emet, that present tense is crucial. Hayotzei mimitzrayim, in the time of Bilam, we might say, right, we could use this on Pesach and say, even today, the Exodus continues. How does the Exodus continue? It continues through the various attacks and mode of attacks that our enemies and the nations of the world have against us, right? This is something that I want to say we're experiencing nowadays. Unfortunately, a lot of the anti-Semitism we're hearing about is kind of violence and the old school anti-Semitism we're used to. But when it comes to the attacks on Israel and to BDS and to some of the some of these things that we unfortunately is a very huge issue for us. So there are, right, it's not only physical attacks against us that we need to be prepared for. We need that our enemies are going to try, but there's also attacks of ideas, philosophical attacks, political attacks, spiritual attacks. So I think that might be part of the message here, that there's, right, be aware of all the threats. Even though there's not the paro lording over us, there still are, right, there still is many threats that require God's protection. That's one of the messages. And that, right, the Exodus continues because we need to nurture, to foster that awareness and that recognition of God's protection that he provides for us. So both as far as the modes of attack and the modes of that our enemies and other nations of the world might rise up against us, and for our own awareness of God's protection. Again, even though it might not be the overt miracles of the Exodus, it might even be in ways that we're not necessarily aware of, we're not tuned into, but that there still is very much the Yad Hashem, God's hand, guiding us and protecting us, and ensuring that all will be okay, even with some scary bumps in the road, perhaps. So it's a very interesting connection. I'm sure there's a lot more we could say or think about, and if any more ideas come to you, I'd love to hear them as always. But I thought that this was an interesting way of thinking about it, and I really like when we're able to build textual connections, because I enjoy delving into some detail of Chumash study with you in these classes. Just one programming note. Next Tuesday is when I take the kids to camp. My plan is to prepare a shiur and be able to teach it, but there might be some logistics that get in the way of that. So I will send up an update during the course of the day when I have some assurance that the Wi-Fi at the camp works okay and everyone is settled as best as can be. And if that all works out, then I look forward to studying Parshat Pinchas next week with everyone. And if not, we'll have to take a rain check on that. But we're going to plan for next week, but be aware that there might be some last minute changes to that.
Thank you, Rabbi.
All right. Have a good night, everybody.
Laila Tov.
Laila Tov.
Laila Tov.
Good safe trip.
Thank you. Thank you. We're very excited for this trip. Everyone's anxious to get to camp. Yeah.